Welcome back to One-on-One. I'm Martin False. What a show we have for you today. I love going back and talking with military people who've spent a lot of their lives in the military. But not only that, they come back to Houma and they make a big difference. When we come back from the break, Mr. Mert Pellegrin, right here on One-on-One. One-on-One is brought to you by the Law Office of Waits and Downer. All right, welcome back to One-on-One. Very interesting guest today on our program, Mr. Mert Pellegrin. Mr. Mert, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Martin.
Now, I don't know where to start with you. You got so many things working. You're on commissions and committees and spend so much time as a pilot, for our country. There's a lot of ways we could go. So let's do the easy route. Take us to the earliest years you can remember. How old were you? And what do you remember? Because I do, right down the street, they had a company that I think your dad ran.
Grandfather, yes.
Yeah, let's talk about that a little bit. But
Sure.
What's the earliest years you remember?
Well, I can remember growing up on Lafayette Street, about 3/4 of the way down to where it crosses Little Bayou Black.
Yeah.
And going through the St. Francis school system.
Mm-hmm.
Our church was, of course, what is now the cathedral.
Mm-hmm.
In the early days, my family sort of focused me a little bit into music. So I learned to play the trumpet at an early age, maybe first or second grade, actually. From there, moved into piano, which in turn, because of Sister Fabian being at the St. Francis schools, I got into the organ music, and actually became the organist in the cathedral, what's the cathedral now, until about the 7th, 8th grade in that general ballpark.
You mentioned Sister Fabian.
Right.
I've heard that name so many times. Was she tough?
She was.
Yeah.
She was. Matter of fact, when I go to weddings and various celebrations at church, I always listen to the organist, and in my own mind, I am critiquing that organist based on the ways that I was taught under Sister Fabian. Has to be smooth. You don't play it like a piano. Mm-hmm. You've got to blend from one chord to the next, and so forth.
What kind of organ were you playing? Back then, the organ changed. They had the pipes really worked back.
Absolutely,
when?
Absolutely.
Now it's speakers.
Right. Well, again, I played it only while it was compressor driven.
Yeah.
And as far as the organ itself, about all I really knew was how to turn it on and off. Mm-hmm. I knew it was a huff and a puff to get all the way up the stairs. I enjoyed being there because I was surrounded by all of the best-looking young ladies in the school who were singing in the choir. Mm-hmm. And that was a good way to start the
You
day.
had it made.
Absolutely.
But except for that spiral staircase.
That spiral staircase.
Which is still there.
It is. I just walked up and down it just night before last for the Christmas celebration.
Yeah.
Listening to even my grandkids now down there singing.
But such good times, and you mentioned St. Francis going through the school system at that point. Everybody I talked to that went to St. Francis, of course they bring up Buddy Marcella and Harold Hayden and different people of that nature, but they always talked about you had to walk a tight rope over there.
Oh, you did. Of course, the one I remember the most was when we were moved over to the boys' school over on Barrow Street. And the brothers would come by, and if you were caught misbehaving, you got the crack on your knuckles.
Yeah.
And so forth. But it was a good way to start life. It did prepare us well to move on into our college years.
Yeah. Now, who were some of your classmates? You mentioned Judge Timmy Ellen Sr. was a classmate.
That's correct.
Okay.
Harold Haydell was another. Buford Otay, unfortunately, passed a long time ago.
Yeah.
Philip Dupre, Gordon Orso.
Yeah.
These are just the names that immediately, Richard Walker, Wazan, Chester Wazan.
I remember Gordon Urso became an insurance person, was my dad's boss.
Really?
Union National Life Insurance Company. I remember that years ago. What was it like on Lafayette Street? We know what it is now. We see it now. But what was it like when you were growing up?
Well, I mean, it was a great place to live. I could walk to school, which I did. I walked both to the St. Francis, where it currently is. I walked over to the boys' school. My father had invested in more property to the rear, so there was plenty of room. He actually would manicure to the best you could manicure the natural grass, nothing planted or anything like that. A little tennis court. He had been involved in gymnastics when he was at LSU, and so he had little parallel bars and devices like that you could go and start trying to learn those skills. I had an uncle, Bobby Wright, married to Ruth Wright, and Ruth was my father's sister. They lived right next door. Another relative a little bit farther down the street. The Laperouzes had the sheet metal business in full swing at that point in time. The street was paved. It was a good place to live at that time.
For all of your cases, including those with catastrophic significance, call Waits and Downer Law Firm.
You mentioned Lafayette Street. Wasn't that sort of close to the end of the city limits back at that time? I know it went a little further, but everybody sees the city limits as being much bigger today. Lumiere's was the power plant way back in the day, but the city wasn't that big.
Right.
It sort of branched out.
Right.
What were some of the things you did for fun? I mean, what did y'all, they didn't have cell phones back then or computers. What did y'all do?
Well, of course, there was intramural sports. I can recall baseball and the proper season. I can remember the Bantam football. Let's see. Of course, you always had the opportunity to go and spend a day or a part of a Saturday or Sunday with one of your friends. Again, I can recall going to Tim Ellender's house a lot because, of course, it was a beautiful home, and they had a little dock where we could go and fish, and we could dig the worms and go and catch the perch and so forth. And
You still see him working in the yard?
I've been to events in the party room in the back, and it's a great place to have things. We're actually planning an event for the airport, where I'm currently the executive director, that is possibly going to be hosting some events there.
So, everybody that comes in this show, they grow up a certain way, they're influenced a certain way, and eventually I want to find out or sort of assess how you got to be a naval pilot, decorated naval pilot, Top Gun naval pilot, but something sort of is the catalyst before all that happens. What made you start thinking about that? Did you have aviation all around you when you were growing up?
It wasn't all around me, in that, on Lafayette Street there wasn't much aviation.
Yeah.
However, my father seemed to take an interest in it, and back then the control line model aircraft were being flown on the CYO lot, if you're familiar with that location here in town. And so every now and then he would take the family out for the drive, and we would go by and we would watch. Also, he had a need to go into New Orleans on weekends and other times during the week. And up in New Orleans, I can recall along Lakeshore Drive, right across from where the Pontchartrain beach was, there was actually a model airplane airport. I'm not sure if anybody else, but somebody like me would remember that. And it had a little miniature control tower, and you could go there on the weekends, and there would be people with really well-built models flying, and we would stay and we would watch that. The main thing that got me involved in, got me where I could begin to realize how strong my passion was when I made the connection with the Farnoff family, and particularly with Corky, who was maybe 1 year or so behind me in school. By then, I knew that his father had some very unique airplanes out at the Houma airport, and the two of us had this passion for it. And so when we would get on the phone at night, I'm sure you did the same thing. You'd call your buddy and talk about whatever y'all had to talk about. All we would talk about was the airplanes, and look, we could buy this one in a periodical called the Trader Plane. Look, this Piper J3 Cub is available for, whatever. So I then got an opportunity to go and help in the cleaning in between the air shows. They were flying these aircraft in air shows. In the cleaning of the aircraft, got several rides. One of my first rides was in the chief pilot for Texaco. He had a beautiful Beechcraft Staggerwing. I wouldn't have gotten that ride were it not for the intercession of my good friend. And the same in the Texaco Mallards, which were the amphibious aircraft that went out to all the structures they had. So those were the things that managed to get me into it. Charlie Hammonds, getting to know Charlie Hammonds. Charlie, when I lost a radio control model of my own, flying it out at the Houma Terrebonne Airport right on a blimp mat, Charlie Hammonds managed to get the use of J3 Cub on floats that he had at the seaplane base. He was just starting his aviation career at the time, and came out and flew over the east side of Houma in the area where we thought the plane had flown away to. Never could find it, but I got made all of those connections, and there are still some of the folks that I treasure.
For all of your cases, including those with catastrophic significance, call Waits and Downer Law Firm.
My dad was a Navy man, so for the air shows, I remember as a young child,
Right.
I would see the Blue Angels fly right over Mulberry Subdivision.
Right.
And that was so intriguing to me, that just the power of these aircraft. So we'd always go to the air shows, and always sort of leading off was Bill Farnoff,
Right.
Corky.
Right.
So they became household names for a different reason. They weren't playing basketball, they weren't playing football, they weren't doing those things. But just what we'd see as a young child is entrenched in my mind so much that I would even go and start drawing Blue Angel jets.
Right.
But that was such a fun time back in those days. And you were right in the middle of that, weren't you?
Well, I was. And that was a great time during my life. I'm still having so much fun now. I pinch myself, pretty often. But that was really special because you never really know whether you're going to be able to get into it, first of all. Certainly growing up on Lafayette Street with one of the most humble families in town, where's the money going to come from, and so forth. But I got some breaks, in that later on also.
Tell me about Pellegrin Motors, was it, right?
Right.
And it was right down the street from it. Was it on the corner, right around where Lumiere is? Or where? Well, I remember vaguely.
Yeah, it's in that same building.
Yeah.
There were two more, if I recall, sections of the building that were available. And the Pellegrin Motors was actually the section the closest to where now the condominiums are.
Right.
And I believe it was Davison Hardware that at that point in time was right across the street. Yeah. The Bijou Theater, I think it was called, was also right across the street. It's the bank now. It started as a Kaiser Fraser new car dealership. When Kaiser and Fraser eventually shut down, my grandfather converted it to a used car dealership. And I actually, again, my first paid job was after schools. I would walk down from the boys' school on Barrow Street down to here and clean them and help the mechanic. He had fixed the broken windows and so forth and so on. And my father actually worked inside as the bookkeeper. And so he did that during the day before going back to our residence on Lafayette Street, where he had eventually built a pretty large number of apartments and had a small liquor store. And so those were the ways our family brought up.
So he was an entrepreneur. He did a little bit of everything.
Actually, my father did. My grandfather certainly was. And actually, I believe his obituary did call him a pioneer.
Yeah.
An automobile pioneer.
Yeah.
Here in Houma.
I always like that word, pioneer.
Right.
That's a little different when you get that word. It means you weren't scared to take the risk.
Right.
To set something ablaze, Did your mama work?
My mother was a school teacher.
Okay.
Again, the whole family, both sides, had moved up from the Chauvin area. So she was a teacher way down near Chauvin. I can't remember the exact schools, but I run into people all the time when I hear the name of a school. I think my mother taught there.
Right.
And eventually she continued to teach school here in town. And both of them had college degrees, which was actually not that common back in those years. My father had one from LSU. My mother had one from USL.
Yeah. How did that sort of set the tone? Just looking at your resume and talking with you, work ethic to me is just such a, you can have a lot of qualities, but if you have work ethic, you're going to get places. Who set that tone more for you? Was it your dad or your mom? It seems to me it might have been equally both.
Actually, both is the way I would say. They both had high aspirations for us. Probably saw more sunshine than there really was at the time, and I would again say both.
One-on-One is brought to you by the Law Office of Waits and Downer.
Did you go straight into the military after St. Francis?
I tried to be honest with you.
Okay.
I wanted to get there as soon as I could. I applied to a few universities that had aviation programs, but could see that it was going to be quite expensive. Finally, I got an opportunity to work as a deckhand on a tugboat for a company that one of my uncles had, and I was able to make enough money that first summer out of high school to pay for 1 semester, 1 year, I should say, 2 semesters at LSU. As it got close to that summertime, I applied to, I believe it was the Air Force Academy. It had just opened up, and hoped that maybe I might be able to get into there. Real quickly, I got a notification back that I was way too late. You've got to start applying for these programs much earlier than I had. So I went to LSU and I joined the Air Force ROTC while I was there. I enjoyed that. That built on the background I had picked up with the Farnoff family, and made me more convinced than ever that I wanted to get involved in aviation, preferably military. When I finally got to the window where now I knew this was the time I should be applying, I applied to both Air Force and Navy, thinking that maybe between the two, if I don't get one, I'll get the other. And time went on, and I was really disappointed when I got the notification back that I had only screened as a third alternate, and it was not to Air Force, it was to Navy. And I was thinking, that's fine, because Bill Farnoff had been a Navy pilot.
Right.
And I always knew, not only in my own mind, but I certainly heard him say it enough, if you can fly an airplane off of ships, then that's much higher status of a pilot, than U.S. Air Force, and not downgrading Air Force pilots at all.
Right.
So I was still an alternate, and it was like, why should I bother going to do all kinds of medical examinations and all of this? And month after month went on as the alternate. And one day I'm at LSU, and my father calls me and says, "Mert, you made it. You have your appointment." And I said, "Well, Daddy, how can that be? I was a third alternate." "I'm telling you, you have an appointment right here in the mail." I said, "When can you next come up here? I have to see it." And so he and my mother drove up maybe about 3 or 4 days later, brought it. I looked at it, and it was orders, report on such and such a date. I never did learn the story, but I can, of course, assume that one of the congressmen had some billets available to assign that he couldn't find anybody that wanted to go. And so somewhere up in Washington, that stuff gets passed around from congressman to congressman. And it came to me. And when I got the appointment, I signed it, sent it right back, immediately. And it was like, all right, this may get me started. Matter of fact, I don't know if you remember Miss Tracy. She was kind of a fixture around the St. Francis schools.
Yeah, Miss Tracy Duplantis.
Okay, maybe that's why.
Yeah,
okay.
yeah.
I was thinking it was the last name.
Yeah.
But
she was an icon.
Getting too old.
Yeah, she was an icon.
Right. Well, she wrote an article for the paper, and it starts with, "Don't give up the ship." And so I still laugh about that. If that was what it was going to take to salvage this young Lafayette Street, child, then great. I was just happy to have gotten it.
For all of your cases, including those with catastrophic significance, call Waits and Downer Law Firm.
My dad was on the carrier, the Bennington, and he used to tell me, and those pilots, just the guts, the precision, you can't miss. You gotta, it's not like today where everything is sort of more guided. It was more on the pilot back then. Tell me your first experience when you got in one of these jets and the awesomeness of it.
While I was at the Naval Academy, we had summer programs, sort of like internships, if you want to call it. And eventually, by the second summer, there was our aviation summer. And of course, I was just, couldn't wait to get involved in it. So they sent us around. I spent maybe about a week or two in Pensacola, While there, guess who I crossed paths with? You may know Pepe LaBeouf, Myron LaBeouf here
Yeah.
from Houma.
Yeah.
I'm walking into the mess hall, and here's this man standing there kind of taking names in case we're misbehaving. And I noticed the last name is LaBeouf. And I'm walking up, my name tag is saying Pellegrin. And so as we both get to each other, I look at him, he looks at me. You know, I said, "Where are you from?" He says, "Houma, Louisiana."
Right.
"Where are you from?" I said, "Houma, Louisiana."
Yeah.
So anyhow, we crossed paths right there. From there, I got to fly in several jets. I actually rode in the back seat for a couple of carrier landings. They would send us out to, at that time, it was the Lexington, was the carrier that was down there. That was exciting. At the end of all of that, I decided that still wasn't enough for me. I wanted to do some parachute jumping. So I had given up my summer vacation, the 1 month that we were supposed to be off. I had volunteered for Army Airborne training, which was in Fort Benning, Georgia. Now, for the Navy to send a Navy midshipman, no less, to an Army paratrooper school, you had to qualify. They were not going to send anybody there that was going to embarrass the Navy. So that was a very highly physical qualification period that we went through for about 3 months near the end of the year. And then once you passed it, then you were allowed to go. So I went and did that. Now my, what you call the first class summer, that's the summer before I was due to graduate. Now you go aboard ship on these summer internships. You go essentially as a junior officer. And that's the time that I pushed hard and got an aircraft carrier. So that was the carrier Saratoga. They flew us over to Europe. It was in the Mediterranean at the time. And we boarded this carrier at Catania, Sicily. And the whole time I was on the ship, I couldn't wait to get to the squadron. The squadron I was assigned to was the VF-103 Sluggers. From the day I walked in the back door of that ready room, it was like, look, am I going to get to fly? Am I going to get to fly? Well, we don't know, but we hear you. We'll make it happen if we can. And sure enough, they did manage to get me in the back seat of my dream airplane at the time, the F-4 Phantom. We went out this one day when everything was starting to work like clockwork, and bang, you know, one catapult launch, up and up, and doing rendezvous and
So take me
radar
back.
type
What was
things.
that like? It's probably still vivid in your mind.
It was the dream of my life,
Yeah.
you know, and more than ever, I knew that's where I wanted to end up. I wanted that airplane, you know, on a ship just like the Saratoga.
You were very driven, huh? You were very
Oh,
motivated.
Incredibly, and still am.
Yeah.
So that was great. We went and flew over Mount Etna, which is a big volcano near there. I had asked if we could possibly do a supersonic run, that I would, you know, love that. Fuel is always tight when you're operating off a ship, but we did have enough fuel to make a very brief, you know, just ticked into Mach 1.2 or something like that, and then immediately slowed back down.
So wait, let me
to
hear
save
you.
fuel.
You want to jump out of plane. You want to go supersonic speeds. You want to do air. You got to have a little bit of craziness in you, in a good way.
Well, possibly to do.
I mean, no fear.
Right.
Have you always been like that? Just no fear?
Yeah,
Most people couldn't do that.
right. Let me show you one thing here
Okay,
that
sure.
I was handed the first day I got to my real operational squadron. It's
And by the way, I do say craziness in a good way.
yeah, I know.
You're good crazy. Let's see. Let's see. World famous Red Rippers, fighter pilot extraordinaire, known to take a drink last of the big time. Trying to read
Spenders.
it. With the spend. Extraordinaire. Yeah, that'd probably be fitting.
Well, that was the culture
Yeah.
at the time. Nowadays, it's a little bit different, but this was bold, and this was the way the squadron thought of itself. Nowadays, following Top Gun, following Navy Test Pilot School,
Yeah.
the culture now is different, and that's you want to be sure that you are humble,
Yeah.
approachable, and respectable.
Yeah.
And I tried to remember all of the fun days
Yeah.
when maybe we did drink maybe a little bit more than we should have.
For all of your cases, including those with catastrophic significance, call Waits and Downer Law Firm.
To be a Top Gun, let's face it, you got to be, like Sean Payton used to say with the Saints, they'd bring the bat, and you got to have a little bit, I'm not going to say cockiness in a bad way, but if somebody's getting in a jet protecting my country, I want them to have a little bit of overconfidence that they're going to complete the mission.
Right. Well,
You have to compete.
yeah, that is, you have to be quite confident.
Yeah.
But the point is, there's a time for that.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, when you're up against an adversary that's out there to kill you, then unfortunately, you've got to take them out first. Mm-hmm. And there's only one way you're going to do it, and that's with skill and practice and training. And we got all of that. That's what Top Gun was created for. Mm-hmm. I was in the first class that convened within the first year that it was established.
Really?
I didn't even know what it was. When, just like in the movie, my commanding officer calls me into the ready room one night on the aircraft carrier and says, "Oh, we've selected you to go to Top Gun." Well, what's that? Yeah. And he says, "Well, don't worry about it. Just think hard about going. If you don't want to go, you can decline it. Yeah. But I would recommend you go." A day or so later, after thinking about it and finding a little bit more about it, I said, "Well, of course I want to go there." Yeah.
This is like being a Navy SEAL, being an Army
Right.
Ranger, being a Top Gun.
Right.
I mean, that's a special honor.
Right.
You probably didn't appreciate it back then, but when you start seeing the movies come out in Top Gun, and how close was Top Gun to Top Gun?
It was actually pretty close. The part that had always impressed me when I was going through it, I thought was replicated very, very well. And that is the initial, what they call the merge. Now I got to do the hand thing
Right.
here.
Yeah.
Okay, so you're approaching each other from opposite directions. And the only way you are going to win in a Phantom is you have to pass so close aboard that you can then convert the vertical capability that your Phantom has to offset the turning capability that the opponents had at the time. Now, when that happens, it is incredibly close, and it impresses yourself, if you're in there doing it, type thing. So for that reason, I thought it was pretty active. There are some negative things that we were doing then that I really thought they might end up showing in the movie, which I guess I'll just say, fortunately, they didn't show those.
Secrets. Some secrets are meant to be secret.
In war, you have to cheat sometimes.
Yeah.
And the way we would cheat was by undoing our parachute, because then you could turn around better and catch where they were.
But if you need that parachute.
That's stupid.
Yeah, if you need that parachute.
That is stupid. And we did
Well,
that.
first of all, I wouldn't even have a parachute clipped to me. I don't think I'd be in that position. So you spent a lot of time. You said 63 to what, 70 what?
75 is when I finally chose to leave.
Okay. That's a long time.
Well, counting the Naval Academy again, it was 12 years.
Yeah.
And during that time, I was committed. During that time, I never thought I would ever leave. Mm-hmm. However, I met a young lady who I'm still married to today, and the children started coming along. And it was like, I've done everything I ever wanted to do here.
So where'd you meet your wife?
Actually, right here in Houma, of course.
Okay.
She was a Robichaux.
Okay.
And I was dating a girl. I was fixing her up actually with one of my pilot friends.
Okay.
And so we would double date, and we would go all the various places you would go here. And eventually, I and the girl I was dating decided that we would go our own separate ways.
Right.
And actually, the guy I was fixing her up with was just like me. We knew we owed the Navy commitment for the Naval Academy training and the pilot training. And at that point in time, there was no guarantee you were going to come back from that. He did, like most of us did, chose to not marry too soon until after maybe he was beyond the point where that could become an issue. So he stopped seeing her, and one weekend I was coming, and I thought, well, I sure have a good time when I'm out with them. He's not here. They're not writing or anything anymore. I called and asked her if she would go out with me. And so that was the first time that we went out, and then the rest is history.
How many kids later?
3 children
Yeah.
and 6 grandchildren
Wow.
at this point.
How many Top Guns are there? Isn't Terry Fornoff one here, Top Gun?
Terry Fornoff is Air Force, and Terry is a great friend of mine. Actually, right now, I have more communication with him than I do with Corky.
Okay.
And a lot of respect for Terry. That man is into a lot of stuff.
Yeah.
But Terry was in the Air Force. His school carries the same name, but it's an Air Force version of it versus the Navy's version of it.
Mm-hmm.
One-on-One is brought to you by the Law Office of Waits and Downer.
But how many Top Guns do we have from this area? Do we know?
Well, we have Ricky Hammonds,
Oh,
Charlie's
Ricky.
son.
Yeah.
Okay, and Ricky actually flew in the movie.
Okay. Yeah, that's right.
In a way, I participated in some of the adversarial airplanes that ended up being part of the instructional course there. Because when I was out of the test pilot school and serving in flight test, the early Top Gun instructors wanted to come and take a look at something that would be as close as possible to the F-5. And what we had in Patuxent River, where I was based, was these T-38 Talons. So they sent one of their top instructors, who had actually been an instructor there when I went through the course. They sent him over to fly against the Phantom. Well, it turned out at that time I was the only person in the test pilot world that had also been to Top Gun. So they put me in a Phantom to go and fly against him, the instructor in the T-38 that was simulating the F-5. And that was a great day. We briefed it thoroughly. We went out, and there were some very specific things he wanted us to practice against each other. So we went out, we did that. They did eventually choose the F-5 to be an adversarial training airplane, and I believe it's still there.
Such an interesting career, and you sort of, I'm not going to say hidden, because maybe in the aeronautics world or whatever, you're probably well known, but in general, you've sort of been low key.
Well, I am again. We saw it on there.
Yeah.
Humble, approachable, respectable.
Right.
That's, I feel like, the kind of way you have to be. I see that in Terry. I see that in Ricky. I see that now more and more in my corporate pilot life, where you run into people, and in some cases, it might be a lady says, "Oh, you're a former Navy pilot," because we do wear things like wings on my cap. I have the wings, the Society of Experimental Test Pilots pin that I wear. She says, my ex-husband, he was an F-18 pilot. I helped him carry around his ego for a certain number of years, and at that point, I just couldn't do it anymore. The more you hear stories like that, it just reminds you that, you know, maybe it's exciting to us, but it's the rest of the world doesn't know that much about it, and honestly, probably doesn't really
Maybe I'm
care.
intrigued about it because my dad made it a point to bring us to the air shows. And although I never became a pilot, I would get vertigo, so I never could be a pilot anyway. It was just intriguing to me. And it was entertainment to us as kids. We weren't in there looking at the instruments like you all were, but it was phenomenal to see that as a young kid and watch Bill Fornoff and Corky and the Blue Angels. And did you fly in those air shows?
No, I never.
You helped
became-
organize them.
I flew in what we called in the Navy demonstrations. I felt strongly that air show flying is, again, a unique type of flying, and it requires somebody that gets fully committed to it, again, practices, and mitigates risk to the maximum degree possible. You don't just go out there and do it on the spur of the moment. I was so pleased to have made the contact with both Bill, Corky, now Terry, and I learned a lot from them just by being in these kinds of conversations with them, and made sure that my technique involved flying to the limits, but it involved smooth application of G and things like that, to the point where you could not destroy the energy that your airplane was carrying at the time. So that's, you know, pretty much the way I learned from them.
For all of your cases, including those with catastrophic significance, call Waits and Downer Law Firm.
I knew the Fornoffs because they lived right down the street off of Highway 90. And, you know, I knew Mr. Bill owned that house. I think Dr. S.E. Ellender
Right.
has the house today.
Yes.
And so I knew I went to school with Rhett Fornoff. But
Knew him.
I think the whole area was shocked when Mr. Bill lost his life
That's correct.
in an air show.
Yes.
We were all like, take him back. You know?
Yeah, my wife Virginia and I were out at her family's camp that weekend that air show was going on. I was already at the test pilot school at the time, but I was on leave. And we come back from that weekend at the camp, you know, with all of the redfish and the speckled trout, and looking forward to finishing off what we hadn't already finished off while we were out there. And Virginia comes running out of the house where the neighbor had put the newspaper, and it already had the article about the accident. Corky eventually called me and said, "Mert, I'm coming home tomorrow morning. Could you meet me out at the airport?" I said, "Corky, I'll be there." And so I went out and met him, and then of course went to the services and so forth here in town. A beautiful missing man flyby was made by the Navy. The Navy sent 4 airplanes over from Pensacola.
And I may be wrong, but was it a Bearcat? He
The
used to
Bearcat
fly?
was the one that Bill met his end in.
I'm not a plane guy, but I remember him flying a Bearcat.
Absolutely. And the airplane that I am the most proud of having had the opportunity to fly, 2 or 3 years after that, visiting with Corky, and he says, "Mert, would you like to fly the Bearcat?" Because he still had his. I said, "Hell yes." And so we went out to the airport, and it's one of those, if you can start it, I can fly it type thing. So he stood there on the side, and you know, do this, do that, do the next thing, do the other thing, to get the engine started. And he gave me a little list of power settings and stuff like that, and go out and do some aerobatics if you want. You know, so I did. I did some loops, some rolls.
I was so gracious to Corky because he had flown in the James Bond movie.
That's right.
And little old me in '84 was making a movie called Nutrient Man, and Corky was larger than life. I mean, I didn't know him. I got a number. I forgot where I got his number from, but I called him to meet him. I thought we met at the hangar.
That hangar is still there.
Is it? I said, man, I need somebody to fly in my movie I'm making. Well, tell me about your movie. So I told him. Now, he just flew in a James Bond movie. He could have said no. He said, I'll help you. And I walked out there, got in my car, I'm going, oh, Lord, this happened. Just a love for flying.
Yeah, he had called me when I was at Pax River in the test world, and they wanted to sell these little BD-5 jets to the military. And he knew I was involved in flight tests for the Navy, and said, can I bring the BD-5s down there, and would you fly it and maybe line up one or two of your buddies to fly it so we can get 2 or 3 pilots, to comment on it. I said, sure. So I spent a couple of weeks organizing through Washington, D.C. and everything. And they came with a BD-5 jet version, not the prop version. I flew it. Then my next door neighbor was another test pilot. He flew it. And then I believe one additional pilot after that flew it. When all of that was finished, they would fly these airplanes around. I don't know if you remember the DC-3, the twin-engine old airline-style airplane. Anyhow, they would they would take the wings off, put these airplanes inside the DC-3, and fly them to wherever they were going. Right. So eventually the day came that they were going to leave Pax River. Well, I was already in the F-14 Tomcat at the time, so they said, Mert, can you come by and fly formation with us in the F-14? I said, yes, I know what the mission is, and should be some sufficient time after I've finished the part that I had to do for test, and I should be able to come and hook up with you guys and do that. So we did that. I went out, did my test, and then came back in the area and was monitoring the radio, and I could see they were getting ready to take off. So I joined up with them, and we did that. And that was, a fun day. Fast forward another 10, 15 years. Now I'm back in Houma as a civilian pilot, and Ricky Hammonds is flying F-14s with the reserves in Dallas. And he calls me one day and says, I'm going to be coming to town, and I'd like to fly formation with somebody. Well, I happen to have a King Air flight that day. And so the two of us joined up and kind of went around town. So that's all fully legal as long as you've discussed it in advance. That's the one rule that the FAA has.
For all of your cases, including those with catastrophic significance, call Waits and Downer Law Firm.
I'm just listening to you, intrigued by a lot of it. But what I'm also intrigued is that you came back, you're the executive director on the airport commission. What brought you there?
That's an interesting point. Of course, I still fly. I still hold an FAA medical. I'm fortunate. My health is hanging in there really, really good. And after going through corporate, I only really flew 2 or 3 real corporate jobs. I was chief pilot for Entergy for 20 years.
Okay.
We had a pretty good fleet of airplanes, some of the top Gulfstreams in the world. Had commuter airliners that served, connected all our deals. So I've done a lot of flying. I flew Chet Morrison here in town, enjoyed my time, bought the airplane for him that kept him, his business productive and making money shortly after Katrina. And at that point in time, I had begun flying the Morris Abair Company's. Brian had an airplane that he acquired personally to help his wife deal with the brain tumor.
It's my cousins, by the way.
There you go. So they needed somebody to fly that. And when I heard, first of all, who it was, because they're such great people, I said, I'd love to do that for y'all. So I was flying them, and that was helping her. She's still alive today, and we're not really sure whether or not that would have been the case had we not been able to get her the treatment that she needed. So while I was there, then they began to realize that drones are beginning to become very valuable in the surveying business. And one day I'm driving to my camp in Grand Isle, and he calls me and says, we've decided we're going to get involved in drones. And the rules at that time required that you have a licensed pilot if you're going to sell your drone services to customers. And you're already here, would you want to do this for us? I'll say, does the proverbial bear in the woods? And I said, of course. So I got involved in starting up their drone program. That's also where, at the time, they had already hired another consultant to help them get started, an ex-Navy submarine captain who had become involved in the Navy determining whether or not drones could be launched off of submarines. That's an interesting story.
Yeah.
So at any rate, we both end up there. That's when I find out he is working with the Houma Terrebonne Airport. Earl Hicks, if you know Earl, was the executive director at that point in time, still there. Basically, they were looking for economic development for the local area. And I think it was the right assessment, and still is the right assessment. They felt that this is something Houma can contribute to national defense, and this is something that Houma could contribute to eventually finding a new opportunity as times change concerning carbon emissions.
And not to mention a big part of our economy.
Exactly. And so right from the very first day, I started telling George that, this program you're doing with drones, this is very closely aligned to what I did when I was a test pilot at carrier suitability. Because back in the 1970s, we were doing fully hands-off automatic landings with Phantoms, A7s, A6s, F-14 Tomcats. I was the project officer for the F-14 Tomcat automatic carrier landing system. I have hundreds, of landings in these airplanes that are autonomously, being made. I said, George, I'd really like to do this with you. And of course, he was wise. He didn't know me, from Adam. And so, we just went about our business together for 2 or 3 years. And eventually I got they needed some more help at the airport, but they weren't ready to pay anybody for it. So I did it as a volunteer for about 2 years or so. Then eventually they realized they were really getting some value out of me, and so they put me on a little small consulting arrangement. And that was fine, gave me a couple of tax advantages, and things like that. And then, sure enough, the previous person chose to move to another job. They had an opening, and the next thing I knew, I got the opportunity to do it there.
Yeah.
And so that's where I am now. It's getting pretty close to 5 years.
Yeah.
And I'll be presenting at the Chamber of Commerce here next week at that luncheon.
They're lucky to have it. Unfortunately, time flies. I even stretched an extra segment out of this because I was so intrigued by what you were saying. So you can have 3 parts, but got about a minute left. If I got, of course, your wife and your kids, and I was able to get your parents back. I was able to, Corky, Terry, Bill Fornoff, we can go down the line, Mr. Hammonds, and I put them all in a room. And I said, you got to give me one word to describe Mr. Mert. What would you hope the one word they would use would be?
Well, I like the word humble. All right. And probably respectable, I would hope, would be a difficult decision for them to make.
Can I add brave? I think you put in a lot of, just to jump out of planes and test planes and be on carriers and do all that. To me, that shows you have a little bit of inner spirit, inner bravery.
Yeah, again, I don't see it as bravery. I see it
That's because you're humble. It's on your car.
I see it as what comes with the territory.
I understand. But I appreciate you you joining us. It was intriguing to talk to you, and I'm sure we're going to be talking a lot more.
Well,
thank you so much for
Again,
coming.
my pleasure.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Mert.
Thank you.
All right.
For all of your cases, including those with catastrophic significance, call Waits and Downer Law Firm. This one-on-one program has been brought to you by the law offices of Waits and Downer.